Um, my book is Do You Have a Voice? And it opens up on a sad chapter where a little first grader was standing up because she was occupied staring at the wall at some pictures. And the teacher came up. The next thing this little girl knew was the teacher was slapping her hands for not listening. She sat down, humiliated, upset, and hating school. That teacher, however, told her parents, I think your daughter might have a hearing loss. And so she was, and my parents were both teachers, God bless us, and they immediately took me to get a body hearing aid and to go into speech therapy, and got me the services that I desperately needed. The body hearing aid was, I had that until I left for college at the age of 18. And when I got my behind the ear aids, when those were powerful enough that I could wear them, I was just jumping up and down for joy. But as a result of that, I was bullied all through elementary school. Middle school was the worst. I moved to a new school. My dad was a principal next door. I had pimples and a body aid. Isn't that a recipe for disaster? And they would, back then we had ink pens, they would throw ink on my blouses and put bubble gum in my chair. And the worst of it was, though, the teachers just turned their heads. They never did a thing about it. So that kind of changed me for a long time. One of the things that I want to say before I go on is, with the hearing loss, the fatigue is horrible. And a lot of people who are hard of hearing or deaf and their families don't understand this. The hard of hearing, even the good lip reader, and I'm a good one because I've done it all my life, only 30% of the words are on the lips. The rest of them are in the tongue or in the back. Also, we have to concentrate twice as hard to hear half as much. And also, if I'm in a group, say I'm at a council meeting, and I was on church council for a while, I'm not anymore. John's speaking and I don't know it, and I have to look around and look at him and listen to him, and then Sue starts speaking. I have to go around the room before I realize who's speaking, and by the time I figure it out, I've lost half of the subject. So you constantly have to be watching and listening and straining. You may remember from psychology classes, the fight, the flight, the freeze are the three ways we've reacted to stress from the time of the cave person. It saved their lives. It saves our lives. If we see a car coming, we run. Just like if they saw an animal that a dinosaur, you didn't fight him, you ran it. The flight, the fight, if it was something you're able to overpower, you do. Or you freeze, which is why so many deer get hit on the road, because they're taught to, their nature is to camouflage, and on the road that's disastrous. But if I'm on my way to the car from my, like say after class and it's dark and somebody comes up behind me, I don't hear them. By the time they get in my line of vision, I don't know if it's somebody who wants to rob me or a student asking me about an assignment. So as a result, my blood pressure goes up, I start breathing very fast, I'm scared, and that increased respiration and heartbeat takes 30 seconds to get there and 30 minutes to decompress. So it's a constant state of exhaustion, and we don't even know that. So with that, I went off to college, and college was worse because of the lecture classes and that professor you always get with a foreign accent. I was in the hospital for 4 times in 4 years with ulcers and a kidney infection. And even with that, the doctor asked my father, "Don't you think she's under stress?" And he said, "Oh, it doesn't bother her." That was his way of dealing with it. However, I got a bachelor's and a master's degree in librarianship. I always loved books and reading. But my parents were very smart in many ways. And they came to me when I was getting ready to graduate from Heidelberg. My undergrad degree was from Heidelberg. And you cannot work in a library as a professional without a master's degree. It's one of those professions where you can't just get a bachelor's. So they said, "We will pay for your master's," which was not really fair because Sue and my brother didn't get that extra year. But they somehow knew I needed that year. And they said, "We're equipping you with everything that you can get to get out there and get a job." I forgot they said that until my very first interview was to be a children's librarian, and I had that stereotypical mean librarian, which I never was, that, "Oh, don't touch the books, you might hurt them." And there was some like that. But she said, "Whatever makes you think you can work with children." And I thought back to my parents and I thought, whoa. So I said to her, "I have a master's in library science. I worked 3 years in an academic library, and I worked 3 summers with a reading club in the local library." And she said, "Well, what did you do with the kids?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, aren't they hard to hear?" I said, "Yeah, but kids are used to being asked to repeat. You just say, 'Repeat that.'" Well, I have a hearing loss, and I wouldn't work with children, and I thought, lucky kids. The next day, I got hired at Akron Public Library by a man who was on the governor's council to hire. It was called the handicap back then. It's not called that now. A lot of people don't realize handicapped is a slur. And the reason for that is it came from handing out a cap for begging. And so people do not like that term. Disabilities is fine. But I noticed like the Library for the Blind still uses the handicap and handicap parking, but it is not used as commonly today. The library was, Akron was a perfect place for me to land. It had a huge deaf population because they were brought in to work in the factories during the war when the men went off, thinking that the noise would not bother them. And sometimes it does bother us more, but the men would, of course, and probably some women too, would never say that because they were good jobs and they got a lot of support. They had a deaf club open 24 hours a day to socialize, and they were an active group, several deaf churches. But I started learning sign language, started doing storytelling in sign language, and just fell in love with the culture. At the same time as that, I was berated by a supervisor in the children's room for helping someone in a wheelchair put a book up or get a book from an upper shelf. And I said, why? She said, she thinks she can be a children's librarian and she never can, and you're helping her.
Oh.
This was all before ADA. Many people do not realize what a difference the American with Disabilities Act has made for all of us with disabilities. Also, American Sign Language was sign language back then because they did not realize, the deaf, that it is a real language. Everybody thought it was broken English because what would happen is, say I'm saying two boys jumped over the fence. I set up the scene first, fence, two boys jump. So it's completely off of the word order of English. And people for years thought these kids were learning broken English when it was a language. And it wasn't until videotaping and you had these linguistic people studying that it has every single element that our English language does, that it was recognized as American Sign Language. At the same time, the deaf culture didn't know they were a culture, and they didn't really care because they had their own people, they had their own clubs, their language, they went all over. And again, people studied it and said, when you have your own language, your own social gatherings, your own, they had bowling leagues, they still do, clubs, churches, those are the signs of an actual culture. And for a while, the deaf were very uncomfortable because they didn't want to be separated from hearing people and ostracized. However, hearing people began to take notice, and a lot of it was the deaf theaters. You know, they would have their own shows, and hearing people started coming and asking and learning your language. And so now we know that deaf is a culture. So I was in there at just the special time. After several library jobs, I went into a real midlife crisis and a depression. And I went for counseling, and my counselor had a PhD in psychology, but he had a master's in rehabilitation counseling. He said, you never talk about the library. You need to go get another master's. And I said, no. He said, yes, you do. It's not fair to the deaf not to go. So I started rehabilitation counseling classes in 1988. The ADA was passed in 1990. And a lot of people don't realize with that legislation, it was the only civil rights legislation ever passed by a Republican president, George Bush. However, Tom Harkin was in the House and he had epilepsy, so he got it pushed through the House. And Teddy Kennedy was in the Senate and he got it pushed through the Senate. Plus, all disabilities got together and marched in the streets to get that passed. And I certainly hope that it never goes away. It concerns me. I also learned the hard way, among the inside secrets of the deaf community are the arguments between what we call the oralists and the manualists, the people that sign. And I thought, I'm going to stay out of this. Well, you can't. I was doing story hours in sign language for one of the libraries, and the head of the school system in where I live, in the Canton area, was a huge oralist. And the junior club would come into the library every year, do a Christmas program in the basement, and then they had us do storytelling on the first floor. And I was in charge. I was a children's coordinator, so I set up all the storytelling, all the scheduling, and I would do mine in sign language, saying to the children, do you know what this is? And I would say something without voice, then I would use signing, and they loved it. Well, Canton was so backwards. They did not allow the kids who were oral to be in the same school as the kids who were signing. They were in separate schools, so they wouldn't, you know.
Contaminate each other.
Yeah, they do terrible things to each other. But I'm telling you, I went to that oral school. Those kids all knew signing. I would do programs. They would sign on the bus and then put their hands behind their back. And then when I came in the classroom, if the teacher had her back turned, they'd start signing to me. I mean, they knew. So this fight to not allow children to use their own language was a bitter one. Back to the library, the head of this program came to me and she said, what happened is the kids got in the same bus, so they got contaminated. And the kids in the basement that came first were the signing kids. They went up and told the oral kids, and the oral kids were all excited. She said, you cannot use story hour when signing with them. I said, why not? I've used it we had 1,000 kids come through the library that week. She said, you cannot do that. And I thought, lady, you're on my turf. I didn't sign, well, sort of didn't sign when I went to your oral classes. So why? But I knew that my supervisor was kind of a junior league type of person and never wanted to make waves. So I used mine. I did mine instead of signing. Do you know that woman, there's a little boy that started crying, and this was December, it was cold, went outside and stared through the library with a little boy to make sure I did not do any signing behind her back. I almost used some other signs with her.
The ones we all know.
So I was aware of all of these facets of deaf culture. So after I completed my coursework, Kent came to me and said, why don't you go to National Technical Institute for the Deaf and get your internship there and just spend a semester there? And I went, oh, that would be fantastic. So off I went to, we called it NTID, and I learned so much there. Again, the kids came from the oral schools, they came from the signing schools, and there was a lot of inattention. However, the teachers and people who had been there much longer than I had said, by the end of the semester or the end of the first year, it didn't make any difference. And one professor told me, I never ever saw a child reject the deaf culture. I mean, once they got in there, they just loved it. But it was a real challenge because, well, and this is another cause I'm on, as Sue warned you. The reason that they developed NTID, Gallaudet was already set up, and I wouldn't have been accepted there. It's a very traditional deaf parents, deaf children, deaf culture, and it's a liberal arts. And the Congress did something right. Imagine that. They thought we need a technical school. And just then, it was developed in 1960. The measles epidemic was deafening many, many children. And they knew these kids would need an education in 18 years. So they opened up NTID. And NTID and Gallaudet have a separate funding, separate from everyone else. And they, the resources on those campuses are just incredible, really unbelievable. So but then measles got eradicated, so they started accepting students from other countries. 1/3 of my students there were from Russia, China, different countries. Some of them didn't know signing, and some of them didn't know English. So the professors there threw me into an orientation class and said, "You teach it." I said, "What?" I don't know if they had confidence in me or they just figured, we'll throw in there and see what happens. But the oral list and the manual list, it was interesting. I remember one young man who went up there to play hockey because NTID is a part of RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, which has a fantastic hockey team. In fact, they got rid of football so they could put all their money into the hockey. Really. And he wanted to play hockey. And he said, "I know I won't have any teeth by the time I'm a senior, but that's being a hockey player." I really liked this young man. But he said in class one time, "You know what? I was not accepted in high school because I was too deaf. And I'm not being accepted here because I'm not deaf enough." And he said, "And I don't like deaf people." Well, some of the deaf stood up and really went after him, and I said, "Calm down." I said, "First of all, you need to learn the deaf culture." He said, "They're rude." Well, some of their mannerisms seem rude, but it's the culture. For example, if you walk in front of someone, you never sign, and I didn't know this, "Excuse me," because you're interrupting their flow of the language. So they just go on through. Well, that's considered rude in hearing culture. So I was busy teaching them all of these different aspects. So that was kind of different. But anyway, my most profound experience there, and that's where the title of this book came from, was that I had a young woman from China, and I knew that in the Chinese culture they often just ship them off to America or somewhere else, and they really don't deal well with disabilities because there's so many of them. And she had come from California and signed extremely well. And she was in my class, and I was talking about Marlene Matlin. And I was explaining when she introduced for the Oscars, she has an interpreter. I've heard her speak locally. She takes him everywhere. So the first part of the speech, she had him sign. The second part, she had learned the names of all 6 nominees and practiced because she wanted people to learn that some deaf people can talk. Well, that just set the whole deaf world on fire. You betrayed us, you did all these things. And actually, I think she made a very good response. She said, "I'm not getting involved in this anymore." And she went off, and now she does a lot of causes for captioning and other services, but she doesn't spend much time anymore with the deaf community. But this Chinese girl came up to me at break time, and she said, "What's a voice?" And I looked at her and I realized many of the students didn't use their voices because they'd been made fun of. And I thought that was the case with her. Some of them had some hearing, so they used their voices. And I said, well, I started to explain, do you know those same kids, they were all 18, 19 years old, who had been fighting the week before, surrounded her. And it was one of those classes I just stepped back, and each one of them started explaining to her what a voice was. And she came to each one of us and she said, do you have a voice? Because in China, they don't have the services. They don't dream of speech pathologists or any of that. And she did not know that she had a voice. So that's where the title came from. I came back to Ohio. I spent the next 17 years counseling deaf, hard of hearing, speech impairments, and then and I got Sita, my hearing ear dog, who many of you remember. I still miss her so much. She passed in 2022, and Circletail was worried about me being by myself in the apartment because I can't hear people coming in. So they could not find a dog right away, public access. So they sent me little Davina, and they said she had been started in the program, but then her leg gave way once and they didn't want to partner her with anyone. And Sita's foster mom had adopted her, and she said she nailed all of the sounds, and you can have her, but I want her back until we get another dog. And when I first saw this tiny little Jack Russell mix, I went, oh. But we bonded beautifully, and boy, is she on top of things. She alerts me with the microwave, the Keurig. When people come, she actually does a couple short barks, which my neighbor, who's a widow across the hall, appreciates. Amazon, post service. I've also taught her I can't wear my hearing aids in the summer when I walk her because they get full of all kinds of liquid and things. So I can't wear them. But I've taught her, and she learns so quickly. When I'm walking with her, I would watch, and if there was a car, I'd step off to the side and give her a treat. And she's learned that. Now she goes right off to the side and stares at me to let me know that a car is coming. And that's been a lifesaver.
And that you're supposed to give her a treat.
Oh, yeah.
Well, she's very treat oriented. Believe me, I didn't know Jack Russell's word, but she is. Well, what happened is after 2 years, I contacted them and I said, where's my dog? And they said, well, I said, can I adopt her? They said, okay. I think they wanted that all along. I think they knew I have cancer. They didn't know how long I would live. I had gone from a yellow lab to a smaller dog because I went from a townhouse to an apartment, and I think they just felt the fit was good. What's happened is the little coffee shops have all fallen in love with her, and she still goes to Starbucks and local coffee shops, and in the morning, if I don't go, she just sits in front of me and stares until I go with her. I go with her, she doesn't go with me. I found out I had cancer in 2010, a very rare blood cancer, and was told the average lifespan was 8 years. Well, I showed them. But there's been so much new research and so many miracle drugs that I have been very, very lucky. But I lost more hearing. I lost 30 decibels and went from severe to profound hearing loss. So now I understand more what it is like to be totally deaf, and it is not fun. And it was the middle of COVID. I found this wonderful, I was using it in church today, live transcribe on my phone, that transcribes everything right on the spot. I found clear masks, and the hospital finally got them after I pestered them enough. That's, I think, why they put me in the committee to start the new cancer center. I complained so much they put me on the committee. But I started also to write. I had been teaching deaf culture at a community college and loved it. My health got to the point where I could not do that, so I decided to teach by writing. I've written almost 250 articles for Cure Today. I wrote this book, which was a long process, and then I sent in a story on CETA to Chicken Soup for the Soul, and it was accepted. I was shocked, and I had a Zoom meeting with them, and they said they had 5,000 applicants for 101 stories. So, CETA, people know about CETA all over the country. So, I want to finish up because I know you want to get out of here. One of the mottos of my life that I think every one of you share, I know what a giving and mission-oriented church this is, and I belong to UCC back home that is the same way. But I wrote this for Cure, and it was titled Looking for the Light After MDS. I was reading Louise Penny, who is one of my favorite writers, and Gamache in there, the detective main character, wonders why this little firefly has a light. Maybe to show us a light in the dark and to resist. Then I read a devotional by Ruth Garrison where she explains, that I didn't know this, some of you are Bible scholars, you might have, but the reason for Jesus' birthday being celebrated in December is because December 21st was the longest night of the year, and early Christians wanted to celebrate the light. Then Regina Brett, another one of my favorite authors, who is from Cleveland, has written several books, but Little Detours and Spiritual Adventures, she says it takes one candle to make the darkness disappear. And people in the lighthouse are called keepers of the light. And sometimes you're just the light by your example. So it is up to us to be the firefly, to think of the baby Jesus and the lighthouse. And many times we don't know what kind of a beacon we are to others. But we can make darkness bright for others, and that is a gift. Thank you. How did that applause? Oh, questions?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I didn't allow questions.
About Marley Matlin. She was in a short-lived series that was on a cable channel that's now called Freeform. It was
Separated by birth?
called Switched at Birth, yes.
I love Switched by Birth. I love that show.
She, and the daughter, she was also actually deaf, wasn't she? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Excellent job. And I've always liked it. I've seen Marley in multiple shows, but
She's amazing. Now, she is married to a policeman who's hearing, and she does a lot of, not a lot, several videos on how to react if you get pulled over for the deaf, because deaf don't hear and then they get shot, and we know those things happen. And they have 4 hearing children. So she's really in both cultures, and that's the best.
I know, when this is like 40 some years ago, so I don't remember the details, but when I worked at Cardinal Glennon, one of the other nurses had a baby. I can't remember how old, but in the first year got meningitis, bacterial meningitis. So it was treated with an antibiotic, again, I don't remember which one, that caused him to be deaf. And when it came time to go to school, I remember she said the doctors told her, don't send him to, I think, what is it, St. Louis Institute? for the Deaf?
CID.
A CID that's totally,
Oral.
Oral? Well, they told her, don't send him to the one that's just sign language, because he would learn sign language anyway. So send him to the oral school.
Central School for the Deaf, I have friends in Ohio that went there. They slapped the kids with a ruler till 6th grade if they ever attempted to sign. Now, it may not be that way now. These are people closer to my age. And then in junior high, they realized that they kind of had to give up. But it's very, very, very oral. And I don't, the myth is if they learn signing, they'll never learn to speak.
Yeah, that's kind of what they told her. Send him to the place where he'll learn to speak, because he'll learn to sign anyway.
Well, what happened is many of the deaf, and they're bitter because they lost a lot of learning, join the deaf community when they graduate anyway, and you know, they're very active. But the problem is, a deaf person once said, I spent months learning how to say a word and I still don't know what it means. The signing gives them the preparation of the language, and actually it should be all of them. It should be oral if they want it, signing, total communication they call it. It's not as bad as it used to be. I am speaking at a Hearing Loss Association of America convention in June, and the last one I went to, they had, it was an international, not national, and they had people from all over the world, and they had your, Paul will love this, they had everything set up on your phone so that it came up on your language. And the director said, it's a form of captioning, the director said the Japanese and Chinese were really hard to do. But those younger kids, I call them kids, they were in their 20s, maybe in 30s, were signing, speaking, cochlear implants. And I noticed, I said that to her, she said it's changed. They're using pretty much everything now. But my generation is the one that remembers all of the work that the deaf did to get them there. And so,
I just remember that 40-some years ago, that's what they told
I'm
me.
sure.
I'm sure they did.
So signing is different for each language then, right? It's not
Yes,
just
it
signing.
is. Yes,
Oh,
it is.
Okay.
I had a Chinese student that showed us Chinese Sign Language, and the characters are developed just like the language. And her parents were deaf, and she came to this country to bring her parents over. This was before Trump, but this was several years ago. But when she demonstrated it, it is in the same as the written language.
I've always wondered that.
Yeah, yeah. They tried one time at a convention in Sweden to get a universal sign language, but what happened is what was acceptable in one language was vulgar in another. For example, in Japanese, it's mother, father, sister, brother.
Ah.
So they finally just gave up. It was too hard to do.
One funny story, she's got this wonderful app, and we're together a lot. Now, I was in Ohio, we went to a restaurant, she has the phone down because it can pick up what the waiter says and picks up what I say, and I don't have to look at her all the time so she can read lips. And the waiter came to us sort of out of nowhere and said, "Have I offended you?" And we didn't know what he meant. I said, "Why, no, you've been nothing but great." He thought we were recording him and then going to turn him in for some such thing. And now she's learned when we go out, she'll say, I'm recording you because I can't hear, I'm not recording you to get you in trouble. But he was just over the top. What have I done to, yeah, and we said, no. So now we announce it. She puts the phone down and we say we're recording it, but anyway.
Is that app available on the App Store? That particular app you're talking about?
Pardon?
Is that app available?
Yes, it is. It's called Live Transcribe, and you can Google it. And it's free for Android phones, but iPhones, that's Apple for you, charges $5 a month.
I want to know how you guys would fight when you were little.
We didn't fight very much,
No,
really.
we didn't.
I was 6 years older, and I was in school by the time she was born. I had a brother in the middle. You know, it wasn't, and I really was very aware, sometimes more than my parents, I think, but they were responsible for getting her to, because they wanted, and her speech is almost perfect. And that's Kent State speech and language people, they did that. They were interested in getting her fully acclimated to society so she could cope. So I would see things sometimes and say, oh dear, this isn't right. You know, she couldn't hear music, couldn't get the words on a record player, so I'd write them out for her. And because I'd see her bent over with her ear to the
I always like to tell that story. She was my first captioner. And the record, I love dogs always. It was Lassie Come Home, and there's a song, Run Lassie Run, and she saw me doing this and she wrote out the words, and that meant everything to me. She was always sensitive.
How old were you when you realized that you were?
I didn't, because I thought everybody heard the same way I did.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I had nothing to compare it to, so I didn't know. The teacher is the one that discovered it.
But you already had taught yourself to read lips too. By the time she started speech and language therapy, because she's pretty smart, she really is. And she had already taught herself to, now she was very, when she was little, you would notice we'd have dinners at the house, and she would, if you weren't looking at her, she'd get your face, and she wanted you, and you know, we thought it was for attention. She wanted to read your lips.
Mom said I did that as a baby. She said, I wondered because your brother and sister didn't do that, you'd literally pull my face down in the crib, and I didn't know why.
I'm surprised that teacher suspected hearing loss and still slapped you on the hand for not paying attention.
Well, she had the same teacher.
I wouldn't be surprised.
She was a force to contend with.
You know, my son is deaf and hard of hearing because of antibiotics at 3. And he was in a 5th grade class, and they kept saying, you know, he stares off into space. And when we finally sat down and talked to him, he was getting about every other word, which was just gibberish. You know, when you have a phone call and you can only hear part of what people are saying, it is so hard to figure out what they're talking about. He just skipped it. And that's when they let him start using sign and got him a sign interpreter so he didn't miss those strings of words.
Yes.
And as he got older, he ended up getting a cochlear implant because the sounds in the words, as you get more sophisticated, are subtler and softer, and he couldn't hear them. And so he couldn't make a difference between certain words.
Yeah, he's my brother. I would say, "What's up?" He'd think I said, "Shut up." I said, "What's up?"
I bet you know this sign.
Yeah.
That's shut up.
Yeah, he would have been using that a lot.
Yeah.
Janie, please.
Oh, you sort of answered it, but I knew the family of a girl that got one of the very first cochlear implants in St. Louis.
Wow.
Yes, and obviously made all the difference.
They're so sophisticated now, they have a channel for music. Some of my friends who lost their hearing later in life had cochlear implants, and that just meant the world to them when they could listen to music again. And I wanted to also say, Ohio, it'll probably be taken away, everything else has, but Ohio has they demand that children be tested at birth for hearing loss. And it can be done through an instrument, nothing invasive for the child. And then the parents have to bring the child back to be tested again. Some of the parents don't do it. But the ones that do, we have a wonderful quota club in our county that does not want any child to be without hearing aids. And hearing aids are outrageously expensive, especially the ones that I have to wear, several $1,000s. And they make sure every child in our county has hearing aids as soon as they're diagnosed.
Well, and the ADA has done a lot, because you could have had at Heidelberg and in college, you could have had a note taker.
Oh, absolutely.
But see, she was before most of that. You could have an assistant, you could have, and we had kids like that in school, in grade school and high school. They had an aide with them that could hear and help, and she didn't have any of that.
No,
wonder
I
she
probably
was
would have
sick.
done better.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you'd done better, you probably wouldn't have been so sick,
Yeah.
We're so tired.
or so tired.
Back to
Yes.
celebrities with hearing loss, wasn't Nan Fabre also hard of hearing?
Was what?
Nan, what was it?
Nanette.
Nanette Fabre, wasn't she?
I
hard of
think
hearing?
you're right. I forgot about her, but yes, she did a program when I was in Akron, and the deaf community absolutely came out, and it was interpreted, of course, and they lined up for I left after a half hour, and she signed every one of her books for them. She was a fantastic person.